Okay, Chapter 1. A rainy day in a little town called Chimaltenango. It was 1983, and usually Guatemala has a very tropical climate, which means it rains. There's no fall, summer, spring, and winter like there is here. There's just basically summer all year long with thunderstorms. But that summer in 1983 had been actually a very hot summer, and there were not a lot of thunderstorms. And so the farmers, because Guatemala has, it's a very, back in 1983, all they had was farming. And even now they still import um, bananas, coffee, and beans and stuff like that. But back then, farmers were worried because, definitely their crops needed water. So, um, my mother was told that she was going to have her son towards the end of September. And because she had already had a previous son and a previous daughter, she knew that this third son of hers was going to be via C section because her first two kids were not able to be born naturally just because the way her pelvis and her uterus, it's too narrow for the full body to go through, a full baby body to go through. So they gave her a date, and that date was September 27th, 1983. And so she was ready on that day. And, my dad, who was a police officer, was working that day, but they weren't really sure when the process was going to start because they actually needed my mom's water to break and for her to start getting contractions in order to start the operation. I'm glad that I was born in a time when there was actually a hospital in that little town. Otherwise, I would have had to been born like at home where my mother was born in a house. Anyway, so it was a very windy and cloudy day, but it was very hot. And it had been cloudy for a couple of days, so a lot of people were hoping for rain, but not expecting any rain because it just had been cloudy and muggy, and not a lot of rain had fallen. So all the farmers kept looking up at the sky, worried about the rain, and finally it did start to sprinkle. And by around 3 p.m., it was finally pouring rain. So that was a great thing for the farmers. They were all rejoicing, happy. A lot of them would go out to their crops and make sure that all their crops were getting watered. Um, of course, for my very pregnant mother, this was a ordeal because in Guatemala, um, or at least in Chimaltenango, where she lived, they didn't really use car. They didn't have a car because everything was within walking distance. So they had to call a car, a taxi, to take him to the hospital because my mother's water broke around the time it started to rain, and they took her to the hospital. They got her ready, but they only had one doctor that day, and I don't know if that was a common thing, that there was just one doctor per hospital. It wasn't really a hospital; it was more of a clinic. And right before my mom arrived for her C-section, the doctor had been called by the police because two farmers had gone out to their fields to see their crops getting watered, and it was a really strong storm, and thunder was falling, and they had actually been struck by lightning and killed instantly. So the doctor, who back in the day they didn't have, like a a special person that I don't even know how to say their name, coroner, something like that. Um, a special person that went out and examined the bodies and you know anyway, so the one doctor was called out before my mother arrived, and he had to drive, for a long period of time, and the it was raining so hard that the streets were flooding, and he had to drive off to this farm, and he got there, and he just basically was like, "Yep, they're dead. They're fried. Lightning struck, died on the spot. They're dead." And then they had to send another vehicle to pick the bodies up and everything. But during this time, though, my mother was starting to get, worse and worse pain. And the doctor was having a hard time getting back to the hospital. And there was only one nurse on the staff. And she didn't live in Chimaltenango. She lived in a nearby village or city, a smaller town. And there was only one bus that would literally take her from Chimaltenango to where she lived. And that bus would leave at 6 p.m. And so when my mom arrived at 3, 3 became 4 p.m., 4 p.m. became 5 p.m. And at around 5:45 p.m., the nurse who also was she she was in charge of the anesthesia. She was like, "I'm sorry, but if I don't leave right now, I'm not gonna have a place to sleep here." She didn't have any family in Chimaltenango, and she wasn't gonna be sleeping at the clinic all night, so she was like, "I'm leaving." So that was a big problem because now there was no person to help with the anesthesia. And so just after she had left, 5 minutes after she had left, the doctor arrived, and he was soaking wet, and he was like, "Where's the nurse?" And they were like, "Oh, she already left." And then the doctor sent somebody out to go call the nurse, and they were able to catch her before she got onto the bus, and they brought her back. And the doctor was like, "We have to, the baby's gonna come out, we have to do a C-section, you have to stay, we will figure out how to get you home later." So then the whole procedure began. My grandmother was with my mom. My father was actually working at the time, and he was a police officer. They didn't have police cars back then, they rode bicycles. And so, and my dad even didn't even have a bicycle. He was more of a security guard at the police station than an actual guard that drove around the city. So another guard let him borrow his bike so he could drive his bike to the clinic where my mom was at. So they, finally started the operation on my mom, and, thankfully a couple of minutes later, I, was born. And right away, the doctor started to see that I was having, it wasn't like a normal, I mean, it was a C-section, but besides that, um, I was having trouble breathing, and every time I would try to breathe, I would like choke, and the doctor had to pat me in the back a couple times, and finally I started to cry, and they were like, "Okay, he's crying, he's breathing, that's great." But then after I was born, right after that, I started to throw up a lot, and it was just yellow phlegm. And the doctor was like, what's going on? He was like, back then in '83, they didn't know they really didn't know what what to how to diagnose things. And the doctor asked my mother, how are you eating? Have you been eating healthy? And my mom, during the last month of her pregnancy, she had gotten a lot of cravings, and she had literally eaten day and night oranges. She got this huge craving for oranges, and she had eaten them a lot. And so she told that to the doctor, and the doctor was like, "Well, I think the baby is throwing up oranges," which I don't really think that could be happening. My mom ate so many oranges that the oranges got all the way to me, and I was throwing up the oranges. I don't Somehow that doesn't sound right. Then I finally stopped throwing up. I was crying. I was fine. Um, the whole. My dad got to the hospital. He was very happy to see me. I was his first child, so he was happy to see his little boy. And then came the whole circumcision thing because they said they had started to do that. And my dad got into a big fight with the doctor. My father was like, "You're not touching my son. You're not cutting anything off. He's perfect the way he is." And so they skipped the whole circumcision thing, which I don't mind. Then something weird started to happen. I was throwing up orange phlegm. Then I turned orange, and after I turned orange, they were like, "Well, what's wrong? Why is the skin turning orange?" I was breathing normally. They were giving me, food and everything, and I kept changing color like a chameleon. I was orange, then I would turn like a shade of purple, then I would turn a little bit blue, then back to orange. They didn't know what was going on. And the doctor was like, "Something's wrong with his blood," because, you know, they just thought maybe something's up with his blood. And they even thought that my mom and my dad were literally siblings, because back in the day, in those days, siblings or cousins, it wasn't strange to see them get together and get married. I have an aunt who married her cousin, and her kids were born. They were my cousins, and they were fine. They had um what's that thing called? They were hyperactive, ADHD, attention deficit syndrome, or something like that. So the doctor was like, "I'm sorry to have to ask you this, but are you two brother and sister? Are you two like related in some way?" And my dad was like furious. He was like, "How the hell?" He was just like, "How can you even ask that? I'm gonna screw my sister and have a baby with her." And they were just really pissed off. He was pissed off. And then they said, "Well, you know what? I think we're gonna have to just transfer his blood," which, to be honest, back in 1983, I didn't think that was possible to actually take all my blood out and put somebody else's blood in me. I was like, I don't even think they can do that today when you think about it. Thankfully, though, I finally changed. I was like, okay, enough being a chameleon, and I turned my regular color, which is white, or, light skinned, and that was that. So, I had a very interesting birth. First, the two dead farmers. I feel bad for them. And then also the nurse that was the person with the anesthesia, she happened to be my dad's ex girlfriend. So that was kind of awkward also in the operating room. And my dad came from a far away, like a 8 hour drive, far away, different culture almost. And he didn't really he didn't really think about the words he said. He would just speak his mind. And it was very different from my mom's family because my mom's grandfather was actually president of the whole country of Guatemala when she was younger. So my mom was educated. My mom was a teacher. My grandmother was educated. She had been a teacher. So my grandmother kept, saying, "Hey," to my father, "Hey, you need to calm down. Watch your language." And my father, and then, even though I was a normal sized baby and I weighed a normal weight, they still put me in an incubator because of my whole changing color thing. So I didn't know what color to be. So my dad was like, "Get that. Why don't you guys get that? F that. Get my son out of that effing machine. He's healthy and this and that." And my grandmother had to step in and she was like, "You know what? Chill. They're trying to help him. There's nothing wrong with him being in that machine." And my dad was like, "Yeah, well, they wanted to cut off his, and my mom and my grandmother had to explain. If they weren't trying to cut off his, parts, they were just trying to circumcise him." And so it was just stressful for everyone. But I think once I finally got to the color that I am now and stopped changing colors, everybody was fine. And yeah, they sewed my mom back up. They had to get a car. I don't know whose car to drive the nurse back to her village because by that time the bus had already left. And like my mom spent like one day at the clinic and then the next day she was like allowed to go home. And I went home because everything seemed to settle down. And to this day, I don't even know why I was throwing up orange phlegm. Why I thought I was maybe in my previous life I was a chameleon and I was trying to still be a chameleon in this life. But thankfully, everything fixed itself naturally. And well, it wasn't until I was a teenager that they realized that I was born with two brains and something that could have been something. But thankfully, that happened on that day. Of course, two people died. That's not a good thing. But it was the first rainy day of the season. The crops got the water they needed, and I came into the world. So we'll let that be chapter one.